Jesus continuously called them by who he wanted them to become, not by who they currently were. And it begins to name them. And it says, Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So here you have these disciples. Now, the first one, and in all renditions of the disciples, Peter is always listed first, probably because he's the oldest and he's clearly the leader of the group. But verse 14 begins and it says, Simon, whom he also named Peter. So here's what this means. I put it on your outline. He was born Simon, but Jesus named him Peter. Now, the word there that Jesus used for Peter is the word Petros, which just means a rock. So if it were to say Petra, that would be a big rock. It says Petros, and some people say, well, that's just a tiny little rock. No, that would be another Greek word that we call lithos. But Petros means a stone, like if you were going to build a house and you wanted to have a stone, that would be a foundational stone that you wanted to build around, that would be the word that you would use. So Jesus began calling him a rock. In English, we would say, and I put that on your outline, we would call him the rock, the rock, the rock. As the rock or a rock, that would imply stability. But when Jesus begins to call him the rock, you're the rock, there is nothing stable in Peter's life. And so Jesus speaks this when Peter is not anywhere near stable. How unstable was he? Well, you know this story. Peter's the one who says, Lord, if everybody leaves you, I will be there. I'm solid. You can count on me. A few hours later, he's like, Jesus? I don't know Jesus. Who's Jesus? And he completely denies him. Completely unstable. So maybe what happened, and I'm suggesting that Jesus spoke, you're the rock, you're the rock, you're the rock, over him and over time, and that began to change his identity to the point where after Acts chapter 2, he really is the rock. Verse 14, it says, Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew, his brother. Now, Andrew, the way that you pronounce that in the original language is Andreas, and it just means manly. So apparently, Jesus doesn't change his name. He doesn't have to. Apparently, manly can just man up and everything's fine. But then you go on and you have James and John. Verse 14, James and John. And now these are two of my favorites, James and John. This story is told in 3 Gospels. So when Mark tells the story, he adds and he says, to them, he gave the name Boanerges, which just means sons of thunder. So here's the debate. Did Jesus call them the sons of thunder because they were rough around the edges? I mean, did they wear black leather jackets as they rode into town on their donkeys? We don't really know. So some suggest that he's pointing out their personality. Others suggest that Jesus is just calling into existence something that currently did not exist, that maybe they needed to assert themselves, become a little bit tougher, a little bit more stronger, and so he began to speak that over them. Now, I will tell you one of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of James and John. You all know the story. And this is actually in Luke chapter 9. But they go to a town and the town completely rejects Jesus. And James and John, they're bugged about this. So they come up with the perfect solution. So there on your outline, it says, when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Perfect solution. Lord, do you want them fried or extra crispy? How do you want this to go down? To which we don't know, but I think Jesus was like, I probably should have spent 2 nights on the mountain. But anyways, either way. Then you have Philip in verse 14. Philip just means fond of horses. The interesting thing about Philip is he's Jewish, but he has a Gentile name. And that would be very odd in that culture, especially if you came from a religious background. So my sons are named Daniel, Christian, Noah. You kind of know what team we're on as we do that. So if somebody was Jewish and they named their child a Greek name, it would imply, I would say, that they probably were Jewish in name, but not very much committed to their faith. And so they, apparently got caught up in the culture. But the idea is he can still be a disciple. And so Jesus doesn't change his name, but so that's Philip. But then you go to Bartholomew. Now, Bartholomew is the last one in verse 14. Bartholomew, bar is the word for son, and then Bartholomew means son of Talmai, son of Talmai. Now, in John's gospel, he will not be known as Bartholomew. He will be known as Nathaniel. And Nathaniel comes from the Hebrew, and that just means the gift of God, the gift of God, the gift of God. It is suggested, I wouldn't be emphatic on this, but it is suggested that Jesus began to call him Nathaniel, but everybody else knew him as Bartholomew. And so as everyone else would call him Bartholomew, Jesus would call him Nathaniel, which just means the gift of God. You're the gift of God. And so apparently that would be something that he needed to hear over time. You're the gift of God. You're the gift of God. Verse 15, now Nathaniel comes from the Hebrew gift of God. Verse 15, it says, and Matthew. We looked at this a few weeks ago, but Matthew, as you'll remember, was born Levi, but Jesus would only call him Matthew. And that was the name that Jesus gave him. When he was Levi, he was a tax collector. He was hated by everyone, and he was trusted by no one. But when Jesus meets him, he just calls him Matthew. Well, Matthew there on your outline, again, we talked about this a few weeks ago, just means the gift of God, the gift of God. Now, Nathaniel means gift of God from Hebrew. Matthew means gift of God from Greek, and that's why it's different. I think that Matthew needed to hear Jesus continuously speak over him, you're the gift of God, you're the gift of God, you're the gift of God, because everyone else would call him a traitor. And so he hears gift of God, gift of God. Matthew takes what Jesus says about him, and the only way that we know that he was born Levi is because the other gospels tell us. But when Jesus calls him Matthew, Matthew will no longer speak about himself by his old identity. He will only refer to himself by his new identity given to him by Jesus. So Matthew will only refer to himself as, I'm the gift of God, which, by the way, 2 disciples are called the gift of God. And I would suggest that we look at ourselves and we don't feel all that special before the Lord, but he looks at you and he goes, no, you're the gift of God. You're the gift of God. And I think that's important. But Matthew will only refer to himself by his new identity in Christ, which is why I said a few weeks ago, I will never say about myself, I am just a sinner saved by grace. No, I'm not, and neither are you, because we are a new creature in Christ. Old things have passed away. So you don't want to refer to yourself by your old identity. You are the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus. I will declare that I am the righteousness of God in Christ Jesus, even if my behavior has not caught up with my new identity. And I would encourage you, never refer to yourself by your old identity, only say about yourself what Jesus said. And that's what Matthew does. Well, verse 15, it goes on, Thomas just means the twin. Jesus doesn't change his name. He's sort of a glass is half empty kind of guy. Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem. And Thomas says, well, let's go die with him. It's always negative. Jesus is raised from the dead. Everybody's excited. Thomas says, well, I'm not going to believe it. So I put my hands on his side. So again, a glass is half empty kind of guy. But interesting thing, he's a disciple and he's an apostle and God uses him. Then you've got, verse 15, you've got James, the son of Alphaeus, In Mark's gospel, he's called James the Less. I do not know what to do with this. This is not what Jesus called him, but it's what people referred to him. Less, there is micros. It means small, little, least, less. And so people said it's probably a nickname like Shorty is the idea. And maybe they said, so much power in that little guy. I mean, that's incredible. Well, then it goes on. And now this is my personal favorite. Verse 15, we have Matthew, Thomas, James, and then you have Simon the Zealot. Simon the Zealot. Now, my Bible says who was called the Zealot. Other Gospels just say he's Simon the Zealot. That's who he is. So, a zealot was a member of a fanatical Jewish nationalistic political sect, a revolutionary that comes from Strong's. Zealots resorted to violence and assassination in their hatred of the foreigner. So zealots hated Rome, and they would always carry a sword, a knife, a concealed weapon. And they were waiting for the trigger. Nobody knew what the trigger was, but they felt that there was a trigger and it would involve a civil war. And if you were a zealot, your goal would be to kill the first Roman that you came in contact with. So they were considered assassins. And so they hated Rome and they hated tax collectors, which is very interesting because Matthew was a tax collector. Apart from Jesus, Matthew would never be safe around Simon the Zealot. But because of Jesus, they can minister side by side. So if you're like me, a right-wing conservative, evangelical, fundamental, gun-toting, full-on prepper, apparently you can be a disciple too. So, all right, verse 16. But I like him. Verse 16, Judas, the son of James. Judas, the son of James. And then it says Judas Iscariot. Now, Judas was just a common name in Israel. He's named Judas, but Jesus called him Thaddeus there on your outline. In Mark's gospel and Matthew's gospel, he's just called Thaddeus. And then in Matthew's gospel, it says that he was surnamed Thaddeus. Now, what that means is when it says he was surnamed, in their language, that means that's what he was called by Jesus. He wasn't born that way, but he was called Thaddeus, apparently by Jesus, which just means, Thaddeus means large heart or courageous. So he was named Judas, but Jesus called him courageous. And maybe he was timid, I don't know, but Jesus spoke that over him for 3 years. So what we find in this, and please write this down, Jesus continuously called them by who he wanted them to become, not by who they currently were, but who he wanted them to become. That is, he chose to call into existence something that did not currently exist.